Now, Professor Rúrion Melo from University of São Paulo will present his text entitled Counterpublics and Subalternity, New Conflicts in the Sphere.
Thank you. I would like to thank very much Professor Inzani, Professor Itamar for the invitation. I'm really enjoying the symposium. It's really nice to be here, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share some of my ideas with you all. And I apologize because I tried to project the paper, but it didn't work. Okay, so but we will get it. I hope so. My general idea consists in understanding the grounding and uses of a certain critical and normative concepts related to empirical researches. Critical concepts, this is the perspective I stand for, need to be renewed in relation to the contexts of social and political disputes. They try to understand. So today I would like to show some different uses of the concept of the public sphere, especially the concept of counterpublic, a concept that is helping many authors, is helping me, is helping my research group, for example, and some researchers here in Brazil, to understand such political and historical contexts, because it's showing to be, I think, very open to different political dynamics. And then I guess that, I won't develop the empirical cases themselves, but I will try to limit myself to conceptual reflections today. So my presentation has 3 steps. In the first 2 steps, I would like to analyze Nancy Fraser's concept of counterpublic. First, the formulation of the concept in relation to the necessity of including the more plural and counter-hegemonic character of the new social movements. Secondly, I shall consider a change in Fraser's diagnosis, for whom the concept of counterpublic is tied to the ambiguity, and that's good for me because the ambiguity shows that the concept at some perspective is interesting for critical theory. From the concept of counterpublic is tied to the ambiguity created by the current consequences of what she calls progressive neoliberalism and recent economic and political crisis. Even among other authors, the concept of counterpublic has been used in a varied way to identify progressive or conservative groups, many of them considered actually as right-wing groups. In my third and last step, I would just indicate some more general applications of the concept with reference to the Brazilian context, especially with respect to social reactions to the period known here as Lulismo, from the Labour Party's government, Lula and also Dilma Rousseff, Workers' Party, both between progressive and liberal conservative perspectives. Period which covers then the PT government is centered on the revolts of June 2013 and the pro-impeachment movements against Dilma Rousseff from 2014 onward, but remains after Michel Temer's parliamentary coup. You know, that some different moments, but they are important to me. Well, first, the concept of the public sphere has undergone important changes in the contemporary debate. Once considered a critical category, over time it came to be denounced for being blind to different forms of domination, for not being inclusive and plural enough. If we return briefly to the kind of criticisms raised long ago against the concept as presented in Habermas's classic book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, we could get together some of its conceptual limits. Habermas's aim was to elaborate an investigation of the historical trends of the public sphere as a bourgeois category from the 17th to the mid-20th centuries in England, France, and Germany. It exposed its emergence in the liberal context alongside the formation of what Habermas calls public of private persons, who discuss with reasons, and the newsroom today has presented something about it. and defended Habermas investigating their later transformations within the framework of the welfare state. Its purpose is not only that of historical description, although a great part of the book is based on historical reconstruction, but also to link emancipatory bourgeois ideals to the idea of democracy as self-determination and political self-government of free and equal citizens, a defense of normative principles of inclusion and equality that the public sphere should in some way represent. Some important criticisms against the book emphasize insufficient historical and normative assumptions, since Habermas would have reduced the concept of the reality of bourgeois to the reality of bourgeois civil society in a very determinate period of time and with specific criteria of inclusion and participation. With this, many would be excluded from the reconstruction of the bourgeois public sphere, as Habermas himself acknowledged in his 1990 preface. For example, this would not be the history of the proletariat in the same period, and also not a public sphere sensitive to gender or racial domination. On the contrary, Habermas would have failed to see that the same public sphere had subordinated certain social groups. Nancy Fraser systematized the limit of the classic, liberal, or official public sphere in the the terminology used by Fraser herself, mainly because it would be a concept incapable of embracing a more current diagnosis of the new social movements and political struggles in multicultural societies. The concept of public sphere, according to Fraser, leaves out exactly the alternative forms of public expression, what she calls the counterpublics, or more precisely, the subaltern counterpublics. That this subaltern counterpublics dispute the dominant mode of public sphere. Fraser argues that subaltern groups form, I quote her, parallel discourse arenas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses which in turn permit them formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs, end of quote. And such members of subordinated social groups are, as she says, women, workers, people of color, and gays and lesbians, end of quote. The opinion and view formation in the public sphere, when viewed from the perspective of subaltern groups affected by the effects of subordination and exclusion of existing public opinion and its institutions, presupposes a process of dispute between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic discourses. Fraser relies on Gramscian concepts in order to emphasize the new type of domination in the public sphere. According to Fraser, the power and domination exercised by civil society groups no longer depend on a form of openly repressive and explicitly violent oppression, which in modern times would not only occur in times of crisis, wars, and dictatorships. By being more subtle and internalizing the values and opinions of the majority, the mode of domination based on what she calls cultural hegemony is usually effective, and that it relies on the public consent of the members of civil society themselves, civil society itself, creating a kind of consented subordination. The modern liberal public sphere, in turn, is the political arena par excellence of self-assertion of bourgeois civil society, that is, where such a society exercises its hegemonic domination. Thus, culturally dominant ideas and values that are legitimized by a public consent based on the opinion of the majority produce the hegemonic form of political domination. The official public sphere, says Fraser, constitutes, she says, the prime institutional site for the construction of the consent that defines the new hegemonic mode of domination. But even though in her diagnosis, Fraser identifies the public sphere as one of the most important hegemonic modes of domination, she also seeks to develop a renewed concept of public sphere that is useful for a critical theory of democracy and could make explicit the emancipatory potential of the public sphere in its counter-hegemonic forms of expression and action carried out by subaltern groups. Because they live normally in more precarious social conditions and are not in a position to participate in political processes, both formal and informal, subaltern groups form alternative publics for thematization and deliberation on their needs, objectives, and strategies. Therefore, the concept of subaltern counterpublics must presuppose a conception of political democracy that is more inclusive for social questions, that is, for the reality of stratified and culturally plural societies. For this reason, according to Fraser, the anti-racist movement and the feminist movement, for example, are two important examples of subaltern counterpublics, who organized themselves politically around certain experiences of subordination and domination, creating alternative spaces of socialization where they could form their own opinion, find public condition for deliberation, and produce counter-arguments for the thematization of their social realities. So I'll skip to my second part. A fundamental premise of this formulation of Fraser is the idea that counterpublics constitute an opposition against identifiable hegemonic conditions of domination. But counterpublic, because it's easy, the word counterpublic, because it's counter, then it's against something, right? It's counter, I was against something. Faced with institutions such as the state, capitalist market, and family, among others, and cultural values that reproduce androcentric, racist, and sexist orientations, the experience of subalternity of certain groups in this context would be determinant of Fraser's justification of the concept. This seems to indicate to us that only conditions of subalternity imposed on such groups would allow us to define the counterpublics from a critical point of view, as groups suffering from a certain form of deprivation, exclusion, and social exploitation, and in turn capable of re-elaborate their demands from the emancipatory point of view. However, Fraser seems to have slightly altered his understanding of the role of the concept of counterpublic, I guess, because of three new factors that in my view are somehow connected. The first two factors are connected with Fraser's new political diagnosis, more specifically with an ambiguity of the new social struggles of the present. The third factor presents a reason that is above all theoretical, or more theoretical. Fraser no longer seems to base her concepts on a Habermasian paradigm, placing now at the center of the theory a constitutive separation between economy and society that she discovers in Carl Polanyi's approach. In the first case, especially with regard to gender struggles, Fraser has often stressed the unhappy marriage, which has been consolidated in the last 2 decades between feminism and neoliberalism, among other movements. By criticizing the centrality of the concept of recognition and cultural politics of identity, Fraser denounced the critical theory and even some social movements for disregarding redistributive themes and not deal in appropriate terms with the negative consequences of neoliberalism. In the second case, and already in the more current context of discussions that followed Brexit and Donald Trump's US victory, Fraser was even more emphatic in her attempt to offer an appropriate diagnosis. The achievements of the new progressive social movements, which have advanced since the 60s on issues of diversity and inclusion of minorities, recognition of undervalued identities, empowerment of subaltern groups, among other themes, have not been able to block the unwanted effects of capitalism, which, according to her, are even stronger in the latest form of financial capitalism. It's a critique that Fraser addresses more directly to the left, and which has consequences for the concept of counterpublic. This is because Fraser identifies that other social groups, not directly characterized by what would traditionally be emancipatory and progressive ideals, have reacted politically, both to the consequences of the financial crisis from 2007 and 2008, and to the orientation of certain social redistributive policies, mainly under the government of Barack Obama. It's not a question here that in the face of varied social stratum, certain minorities, such as women and black people, for example, who were subaltern counterpublics, are no longer affected by the economic and political crisis. Rather, in the face of the new crisis, other groups also assumed the status of counterpublic. On the one hand, as not only Fraser, but much of the recent literature on the subject has noted, some of these groups are composed of unemployed, with a considerable number of white men who were affected by neoliberal projects, did not directly benefit from some of the existing redistributive social programs, and who aspired to a more radical political and institutional change. On the other hand, the conditions of the economic and political crisis, despite having mobilized an incredible amount of protests and demonstrations by leftist groups, also mobilized a new right, which was quite organized both in terms of civil society and the political system. From the point of view of a more offensive political strategy of the left, Fraser went on to stress even more radically the need to overcome culturalist and minority perspectives, without ever giving up the autonomy, of course, and plurality of movements. And she defends now, she says, a new coalition, less concerned about the specificity of the different affected groups, and more with the commitment to, she says, to fighting for all the society against capitalism. Only in this way would it be possible to achieve, she says, a new alliance of emancipation and social protection against financialization. End of quote. We can note in this second moment that although it's possible to use the concept of counterpublic for more liberal and conservative groups, even when they react to economic crisis and inappropriate political representation, it seems that the condition of subalternity need not necessarily be aided to such groups. Fraser does not seem to be sufficiently clear on the relation between the counterpublics and the subalternity of its members. That is the reason why several works that use the concept of counterpublic like synonyms of the expression of subalternities have been criticized, as we see, for example, in Michael Warren and Freya Thimpson. For Warren, the counterpublic is not connected with the expression of subalternity, but with a perception of the subordinate status shared by group members in relation to a dominant cultural horizon, provoking a situation of conflict, hostility, and reactions in broader contexts. For Warren, we could consider aspects of a counterpublic in the United States, for example, the Christian fundamentalists. And Freya Thimpson considers some supporters of Donald Trump a counterpublic as well. They are populations that do not have clear characteristics that qualify them as subalterns, at least not all of them. But according to her, they have ideas radically different from those disseminated in the mainstream public sphere. In this sense, it's of fundamental importance to note that the members of a certain public feel that they have this subordinate status, in the sense of being counter-hegemonic from their own point of view. And that is the reason for the existence of an anti-public. Even about another important book, such as Strangers in Their Own Land, from early Russell Hochschild, from 2016, would also corroborate this position, since the deep stories analyzed by her would point to counter-discourses and expressions of indignation of more conservative groups that consider themselves excluded from the interests of the government, interests of the state, and they are talking about all the time about what happened during Obama's government, and directly affected by the economic situation. As I mentioned earlier, If the first two factors point to a change in Fraser's diagnosis of social movements in times of economic and political crisis, the third case concerns the fact that Fraser accepts the assumption of Counterpublics, according to which there is a constitutive separation between state and economy, or more, between society and economy, or more specifically, between marketization and social protection. According to Fraser's interpretation of the separation, we are living a boundary struggle without mediation, and we should choose only one of the two alternatives. Either one is for economy and marketization, or one is for society and social protection. There's no second alternative. If we put together the concept of boundary struggle, which Fraser has also, for Fraser also has a third term, a concept, is emancipation. She aided emancipation to the theory of boundary conflicts. And the conflicts in the public sphere today, we will see then that we are living two moments of aliens. First, in the neoliberal scenario, we were living an aliens of what she says, aliens of marketization and emancipatory movements against social protection. That's the diagnosis of progressive neoliberalism. Then we have LGBTQ movements, feminist movements, and other progressive movements that are not leading us to conducting us to a really emancipatory transformation. But today, there's another one, she says. Today, the boundary shows us something different. The aliens between social protection and emancipation against neoliberal marketization. That's the second, that's a different one. Today is social protection and emancipation against marketization. And the point is that it has to do, an interesting point, it has to do with the majority of anti-capitalist sentiment and mobilization that is not just leftist. So Fraser assumes that right-wing populism is also a kind of counter-movement. Okay, left-wing are also counter-movements, she says. But at this moment, both movements are anti-neoliberal forces. She says they are rejecting the neoliberal project and its hegemony, according to her. And we see something here that the critical theory must take into account in the present diagnosis. As she says, I quote, right-wing populists do have genuine grievances which deserve to be validated. And reactionary populist movements are responding to a real underlying crisis, which also requires acknowledgement. Well, but then it seems clear that this approach creates some critical normative difficulties. In both left-wing and right-wing, if both left-wing and right-wing are movements that represent for her the struggle of the society against economy, or in her terminology, represent the boundary struggle from social protection and emancipation against marketization, then we must ask first if neoliberalism, first, is in fact the central common opponent. I'm not sure. If both of these movements are really united for the end of the neoliberal project. Many of right-wing movements are quite radically anti-emancipatory. Many are racists. Many are anti-political. Many are anti-immigration. And maybe only a minority of them would be on the protectionist side of society against marketization. Then it's difficult to understand this exactly relation that Fraser presupposes to understand what means these movements from society against financialization. Because on economic grounds, a great number of them are clearly defending neoliberal positions too. That's the question. Also, if we think about what the Trump's government is also a government that's not fighting against neoliberalism. The role of subaltern counterpublics in then the third and last The role, again, this shorter department, the role of subaltern counterpublics and their relation to hegemonic culture has been emphasized in some researches on the public sphere in Brazilian history. Despite the constitution of a hegemonic public sphere in Brazil, we also had here the constitution of subaltern public spheres that have been formed by different spaces of sociability, from abolitionist and anti-racist discourses through popular struggles of subaltern sectors, of organized groups, from the organization of peasant leagues to new social movements that entered civil society, women, black people, environmentalists, movements for agrarian and urban reform, etc. It has historically constituted subaltern public sphere in Brazil that, according to Fernando Perlato, I quote, resists in different ways to hegemonic discourses. However, it's necessary to think in a more complex way to understand that the characterization of the counterpublics depends on the relation with new diagnoses and broader events. Today, the uses of the concept seem to depend to a large extent on its emergence in the context of, in Brazil, I think, of Lulismo, that's a term, terminology for is a concept formulated by André Singer, and according to a project of society based on a social developmentalism. Social developmentalism, it's a bad word. It's a formulation by Marcos Nobre. Even the social gains achieved in the period that were the consequence of a redistributive policy coupled with economic growth, even them did not prevent outrage and revolt against the government. There was dissatisfaction with the quality of public services, the precariousness of jobs, low racial and gender inclusion, urban violence, among other factors. Much of this dissatisfaction come to the fore in the revolts of June 2013 with all its ambiguity. But there were also strong opposition to the accusations of corruption by PT government that came together with a radical difference between proposals of government and society, opposition that becomes more evident when the pro-impeachment movements against Dilma Rousseff occurred. From economic counter-proposals to different visions of society, liberal and conservative groups have expressed to a large extent concern and opposition to more progressive social projects. Well, and I'm finishing. It's in this more diverse and complex context that counterpublics are being employed. At SEBRAP, it's a research center where I'm developing some of these empirical researches. We have been researching for some time several of these counterpublics and the public conflicts that they are producing. But I'm not comparing the function of these counterpublics in the researches about Brazil. I'm not comparing it directly with the case of the United States. Of course, the views are very different. And although it's more difficult and complex than it seems, there are important differences between publics that are formed around social progressive issues and other more ultra-liberal and conservative issues, or between the social subalternity of some groups and the perspective of subordination of others. In the last years, I have been investigating at SEBRAP, for example, counterpublics formed by new feminist collectives. They are peripheral feminist collectives. Most of them are new black feminist movements. And by students who, between 2015 and 2016, occupied hundreds of public schools throughout Brazil. And Camila Rocha, another researcher at SEBRAP, used the concept of counterpublic more recently to characterize a liberal and conservative militancy that we used to call here with the generic term as well, new right too. As I understand it, decisive is the self-understanding of this very group as an opponent and agglutinator of a type of counter-discourse. But this is only possible when we understand their position against the framework of the social developmentalism. That is, a perception of this very counterpublic that we were living under the hegemony of a determined project of society that they did not share, or they did not want to share. Quite the opposite. Lulismo, therefore, is decisive in understanding the formation of a liberal conservative counterpublic in Brazil. The avalanche of disputes between counterpublics can be seen in the streets and mainly in the internet. We are also investigating at SEBRAP the disputes between the different social network counterpublics, how they react in digital media, and the reason for the opposition speeches, analyzing the disputes around certain public issues. Thousands of manifestations in social networks, homophobia cases, sexual harassment, feminist activism, military intervention, school occupations, hate speech, fake news, among other issues. A lot of different things that we are trying to understand what kind of conflict it's producing. Well, as I said at the beginning of my text, I could not further problematize all the consequences of the various uses of the concept of counterpublic. My intention here was only to draw attention to how critical and normative concepts must be produced and renewed in accordance with social and political contexts, from which they derive their most relevant meaning for a critical theory of democracy. Thank you very much.